with us for about 30 seconds and then we'll get started. All right. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. So thrilled to have you here for our weekly virtual author series, which we've been doing since early April or so. We've been doing mostly Monday and Thursday evenings just to give you some kind of consistency in your life and have something to look forward to and some kind of a date in mind. So thank you for joining us for these. We're going to be doing a lot more, probably through the end of the year at least. I don't expect we'll be doing any in-person events until 2021, just to be candid with you. And but we're going to keep having a lot of great conversations, some really kind of important, serious topics like what we're going to be talking about tonight, but also some silly moments where we can find some levity and have a little break from the news cycle. So stay tuned to that. You can go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. I'll give you an example. We have a great event coming up in October with two writers, Layla Lalami and Roxanne Gay. That's going to be really fascinating. We also have an event with Matthew McConaughey. So look at the polar opposites here of these two things. So, and everything else in between. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So stick around for that. Tonight's event is co-presented by our friends at DVIS, or better known as Domestic Violence Intervention Services here in Tulsa. We're going to be giving a percentage of all book sales tonight to DVIS. So I would encourage you, one, to buy the book anyway, because it's a great read, and also you want to support Magic City Books, but you can do the great work of supporting DVIS as well at the same time. And we're going to have a little bit of a conversation toward the end with some one of our friends from DVIS to go over some resources for you and go over some of those things. But I want to welcome our very special guest, Rachel Louise Snyder, who is a wonderful writer who actually is kind of annoyingly as talented in fiction as she is in nonfiction. She's a journalist. She just does it all. And her book, No Visible Bruises, which we'll be speaking about tonight, was one of the 10 best books of the year from the New York Times last year, and is just, you know, a kind of a gut punch of a read in the best possible way, and something that in some ways is a true page turner, which is such an interesting feat for, and we'll get into some of that about style and how you do creative nonfiction. But welcome to Tulsa virtually, Rachel. Thank you for being here.
It is my absolute pleasure. I think everyone just saw me put lipstick on, so, you know, hey, keeping it real here in DC.
We're all friends. We're all friends here.
Those of us who are lipstick addicts and wear masks understand the particular pain of this moment.
Yes, yeah. Takes away a big first impression element, doesn't it? Yeah. But thank you so much for joining us. I congratulations on the book. It really is, you know, kind of something that's, I think, such a rare thing, which is a book about something that's very important and very harrowing in a certain sense, but it is kind of unput-downable in the way that the best books are. Now, I know that your background is as a fiction writer. We talked a little bit about that, but, you know, I believe you have an MFA in fiction and you teach creative writing at American University there in DC. And you can really tell that in the way that you've approached this book. My question for you is, was that always the idea for the book, to kind of write it with that kind of narrative propulsion? And two, is it difficult to do that? I think we're getting some feedback there. That was your intro. I'm sorry. No. Pretend like that was your special intro there.
Domestic violence. Yeah. Yeah. Did you finish your question?
I believe so. Okay. So kind of the question was, you know, did you intend to always kind of use this narrative structure that you've done? And, you know, is it difficult to take such a serious topic, but try to make it, I guess the word I want to use is entertaining, but that's not the right word, but it's compelling in a way that fiction is.
Yeah. I thank you for noticing that. I give so many talks at, you know, for domestic violence groups, and I love that because that's real social change, but I almost never get to talk about the writing of the book. And it, as someone with a background in fiction, it determined every choice I made. And I'll just give you one example. And this is, I mean, maybe it sounds crass, but you have to, structure is the most important thing. You know, you'll hear that if you ask this question of certainly any nonfiction writer. And so I had this story to tell of this woman in Montana, in Billings, Montana, Michelle Monson-Mosier, who winds up being killed by her husband. He kills their children, and then he kills himself. In fiction, that's the kind of secret you can't hold from a reader, right? If there's a character who knows that, you have to kind of let the reader in on that. And so when I was thinking about domestic violence, I just kept thinking like, well, if you're writing a novel and you know where your story is going to end, where are your points of tension then, right? And tension is the thing that gets us turning the pages. It took me probably 5 years to answer that question, like really. And I realized the answer to that was, the tension was in all the places that we, the reader, were informed about domestic violence and then saw it happen, saw something that was missed in Michelle's life that could have intervened to save her life. So it's sort of like, you know, if you're a writing professor like me, one of the classic exercises is you have two characters in a room and one of them has a secret and withholds it from the other, but the reader is in on the secret. That's essentially what I was doing. And the other thing that drove me, and I'm really glad that you opened with this question. I feel like, oh, I wish I was there in person, but was that we have 400 years of like not caring about this subject. There's not books like this written on it. There's one from a woman in Australia that's very good, I think it's called See What You Made Me Do. But in general, we have a lot of books on poverty, on homelessness, that are sort of classic literary journalism, but domestic violence didn't have any. And so I thought, I have to write this in a way that like every sentence leads to the next so that you won't put it down, because, oh my gosh, we metaphorically have put this subject down for 400 years. So I was very aware of the actual craft while I was writing it. And in fact, interestingly, just a caveat to that, the writing of it was so intense for me that I could only read poetry. I only read poetry the entire time I was writing it.
I know that when the book was in its kind of later stages, pre-publication, you had a bit of an argument and a fight with your publisher about the subtitle to the book, and the use of the term domestic violence that up front, because you thought that it might either give too much away or be leading too much or alienate readers potentially. What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I've published 3 books, and I'm very passive when it comes to decisions that intersect with marketing, because I figure I know what is going on at the sentence level and they know what goes on out there in the world, right? So I'm not going to like give them a really hard time. But the subtitle, the problem is that, you know, I mean, it's multi-pronged, but when we domesticate something, I mean, I have my dog sitting over here next to me. You probably can't see her, but and we've domesticated these dogs, right? The domestic sphere is the woman's sphere. Domestic violence is already seen as a woman's problem instead of the primarily men's problem that it is. So I didn't want the book to be pigeonholed. And even now, you know, it's gotten really surprising critical acclaim. I'm super, super grateful. But I know there's a whole population of people who, for example, would buy just automatically the top 10 New York Times books of the year and will not buy this one because it has, you know, because they think it has nothing to do with them, or because, you know, I don't know, maybe they're a man or something like that. So I fought really hard, and they won, obviously, because it's in the title, but I still think it is a really problematic phrase. It's also very vague. You know, you think, I go again to poetry. What is one of the fundamental elements of poetry? Imagery, right? Robert Bly, what the image could do. He writes about this. And domestic violence has no image to it, right? Battered woman has an image, but that, you know, that's minimizing, right? Because it happens to a much broader array of people than just women. So that's problematic, and that needed to change, but I think we still need to come up with something that is better.
Yeah, it's interesting the way you kind of look at it from a nomenclature standpoint or linguistic standpoint, because, and how we kind of tame a word over time. It makes me think about George Carlin, the great late, stand-up comedian, used to have this whole bit where he would talk about PTSD, and he'd say it used to be called shell shock, and then it was called this, and he basically said it worked its way down into being called post-traumatic stress disorder, and it kind of lost. It became more clinical sounding and lost some of that. Battle fatigue was another form
Yeah,
of it.
totally. I mean, yeah, you add this pathology to it, this language that like tamps it down, and it becomes much easier to look away,
Yeah, if someone were to be called, say, a wife beater, or which is now obviously a colloquial term we use for undershirts, unbelievably.
How did that happen?
But then you say a domestic abuser, or it does kind of it blunts the edge a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, all of these terms just flatten someone's life, someone's experience. I mean, I think one of the things that domestic violence circles use is intimate partner violence. I prefer intimate terrorism, taking the partner off, because children are often the victims of this. But terrorism gets at what it's like. Again, I go back to the story of Michelle in my book, and one of the things her husband did was go up to the mountains outside of Billings and get a rattlesnake, and he kept it in a cage in their house and would say to her, "I'm going to put this in bed with you if you piss me off," or "I'm going to put this in the shower with you." That is not physical injury, right? That is just pure terror, living under that kind of anxiety and stress. And so terrorism itself, such a weighted term for a lot of other reasons, to me gets a little bit closer to the experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about that, the kind of concept of terrorism from a psychological standpoint beyond the act, right? You look at it, tomorrow is 9/11, for example. The act of the terrorism was not just the flying the planes into the buildings. It was the fear that it let into our entire society. We still look at it today. The way we operate is different because of the fear of certain things. It's a long tail,
Yeah, I think that's really like an acute observation, because it's true. We fly, we don't wear our shoes when we go through, well, nobody flies anywhere anymore, but there's all these precautions. We can't have liquid, even though our bodies are basically made of liquid. Like what, I always say, like, well, I'm just going to drink this whole bottle and then pee it out back into the bottle on the plane, and I'll have just as much liquid as I started. But, it's changed the whole nature of our society. And if you funnel that down to someone who is a victim of domestic violence, it's a great analogy for how they live sort of evermore, just on heightened awareness.
You've written about so many different things. We talk about 9/11. You were very much in that kind of post 9/11. You were embedded in different places. You've traveled the world and done, natural disasters and war zones and all kinds of places that most people would run from as opposed to go towards. But this is not a topic that I think that you would have ever anticipated writing about. But the way it came about was kind of interesting. You had this kind of Minority Report moment where someone basically told you that they were working on a way to predetermine deaths related to domestic abuse.
It was Andre Dubus III's sister. I mean, like, talk about writing coming full circle. I love that detail. I was just visiting him last week, so we're always talking about that fated moment on the driveway where I met his sister. Yeah, she had come up with a program that was based on research done by a woman out of Johns Hopkins named Jacqueline Campbell, who determined the 20 highest risk indicators for domestic violence homicide. And these indicators were weighted. And anybody who is listening who wants to see, you can just look them up yourself. You can go to dangerassessment.org. You won't have the training on how to do the weighting, but you can at least see what the 20 highest risk indicators are. And they're things like, prior acts of domestic violence, strangulation and choking, access to a gun. And when she told me this, I had just come back to America from 6 years living in Cambodia, where I had reported on you know, date rape of Cambodian women, and, you know, fistulas in Niger, and like Tibetan women forcibly sterilized, and all these sort of really heavy human rights stories. And I had this aha moment where I was like, holy shit, like, I'm a feminist who has traveled the world. I've covered all these in-depth stories. And here's one in my own backyard. I was never particularly interested in stories of America. I just wanted to be out in the world, anywhere, somewhere, sort of how I feel right now. And I thought, if someone like me could know so little about this, then I was part of a broken system, right? I, in the media and as a journalist and as a working writer, was part of and a feminist and all those things. I was part of a broken system. So in some sense, this book is my attempt to move that dial like just a tiny bit. And Suzanne Debus, Andre's sister, is incredible. She's still doing the work today. The whole family is like, they're just one of those families, you know, like where every single one of them is amazing at something. Super annoying.
Yeah, they're out there. We have to keep them out. To that point, I want to talk about a couple of things, and I may not articulate it correctly, but I'm going to try to figure out what I'm trying to get at here, which is kind of based around the ideas of education and economics and how these play into this. I heard not too long ago, I was listening to someone, and they were kind of talking about mid-century America, kind of that Mad Men era. And they said there's no one, and I think they were looking at baby boomers, right? Women in the baby boomer generation. They said no one of that generation went to work and was not in some way exposed to some kind of sexual harassment, just because of the time. And if you were in a working environment, that was so omnipresent that it was just like, and in some ways that the women who were there may not even recognize that was part of the problem because it was so widespread.
Right.
Is there a similar generational component to domestic violence in America specifically, where it was, you know, are the numbers trending in any way down? And also, if yes, is it tied in any way to different economic classes?
That is a really packed and loaded question.
Yeah.
And so there's like, my answers are like, yes, no, not really. Well, maybe qualified.
Yeah, feel free to unpack it. I know.
So, I mean, in terms of like a generational shift, like right straight through the 70s in this country, most research around domestic violence, what we called we didn't call battered women until the 80s, sorry. I have to get my decades straight. Most research said that if women were subject to violence in their homes, it's because they brought it on themselves. Like that's my lifetime. I was born in the 60s, you know? So it really wasn't until the late 70s, early 80s that researchers began to say, well, wait a minute, maybe men contribute to this problem a little bit too. And our response to that, and I may be off by a decade, it may have been like early 70s, but our response to that was to build shelters. And that's where all of our money went. And things really ramped up through the 80s and 90s. And it wasn't until the Violence Against Women Act in the mid 90s that suddenly there was this kind of a federal acknowledgement that this was a problem for society, right? I mean, we had passed the civil rights movement. We had gone through the Great Society. We'd done all these things, but we didn't obviously pass the ERA still today. And we didn't really acknowledge this was a problem. Domestic violence has dropped off since then, sort of. I say that with great qualifications, because what's happened is that with the Violence Against Women Act, a lot of states have enacted mandatory arrest policies, which means that when the police are called to a scene, they have to arrest who they think is the primary aggressor. And for a long time, when that was first enacted in many states, they would just arrest both the woman and the man, right? Sometimes that happens less often now. But what we've seen starting in 2013 is an uptick in domestic violence homicides of women. domestic violence homicides of men have gone down consistently. And the theory behind that is that women who are victims have more resources and they don't have to kill their way out of their violent situation. So in some ways, the Violence Against Women Act was, men have been the bigger beneficiary of that, ironically. So it's really complicated. And I have to just say, I just want to add an addendum here that since 2017, rates of domestic violence homicide in this country have risen by 33%.
To what do we owe that rise? Is there any actual data to kind of pin that on?
Well, yeah, we just got those numbers right when my book came out in hardcover. So that was like June of 2019, so about a year ago, a little over a year ago. We won't have numbers during COVID till fall of 2021 at the earliest. And but everything I'm seeing points to just a massive spike in homicide across the board, not just domestic violence homicide. I'll give you one example. Milwaukee at the end of May in 2019 had 24 murders. When I spoke to the DA, by the end of May this year, they had 58. So, and you're seeing that in cities all over, DC where I live, Chicago, LA, you know. The correlation between what's happened in 2017 and the rise in homicides is, you know, people are researching it today. It is my theory personally that it's backlash against the Me Too movement and against the misogynist in chief. You know, Trump has normalized a level of misogyny that I always suspected, but never really heard articulated by people in positions of power, at least not publicly. And so I think women are angry. I think that's what the Women's March was about. And I think, you know, to simplify this to women and men, acknowledging that there are, you know, a large range of you know, on that spectrum of gender. But I think men are scared, unsure what it means to give women power, unhappy with that as a prospect. I'm not really sure, but that's my theory as to why it's gone up so dramatically since 2017.
Well, and you know, you mentioned the pandemic. We're not going to have data on that, but the fact that everybody's kind of cooped up, the fact that so many people are out of work, you know, that when there are recessions, when the economy tanks, you know, what kind of responses do we see when there's a major job loss nationally? Does that have some correlation, or do you expect?
Yeah, unemployment, those kind of factors, unemployment, drug and alcohol use are all on that 20-question danger assessment, but they're not in the top 3 or even the top 5. What the research says is that they're stressors. They're not causes in and of themselves. So someone who's, you know, super peaceful and chill and whatever before coronavirus, who loses his or her job, is not going to turn into some crazy violent person after. But they are definite stressors. And I think, you know, I did a piece for the New Yorker during COVID that came out maybe a month or two ago, you know, a COVID and domestic violence piece. And what people were seeing in their sort of state to state hotlines was that the calls that were coming may have been lesser in number, but they were much more severe in terms of what was going on or injury. Arrests were not necessarily being made. Police didn't want to go and gather evidence in someone's house because of COVID. So there was all these ways in which our systems of accountability were just not functioning. We're slowly getting those back now, a little bit at a time. So hopefully things will get better, but it's grim, and we won't know how grim for a while yet.
Yeah. For those of you watching, we're going to be posting in our chat here some links to keep refreshing that, so you can get a copy of the book. We'll be giving a percentage of all the book sales tonight to DVIS here in Tulsa. And if you have questions, please put those in the Q&A, and I'll incorporate those as we go. I want to kind of jump back up to like the 50,000 foot level for a second. And for people who don't know, what is considered domestic violence in America in 2020? Where does that line happen legally? What is the definition? And how do we kind of make that assessment from a policing standpoint, from a, you know, if you need to make the call because you feel like you're a victim of it, like how do we start defining that?
I love that you're asking me such easy, simple, straightforward answers. You know, the quick answer is that different states have different laws. So what is a domestic violence misdemeanor in one state may not necessarily fit the particulars of a domestic violence misdemeanor in another state. Montana, for example, needs 3, they call them, I think, PFMLA, it stands for domestic violence misdemeanor, basically, but they need at least 3 charges to even have a felony. So, for example, strangulation, which is a felony there and is in fact a felony in all 47 of the 50 states, may not be charged as a felony there, right? There's just ways in which the law is so convoluted and so complicated. Omar Mateen, you know, who did the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, had strangled his wife, his first wife. She called the police, they came and didn't charge him with anything. It's a felony in the state of Florida, even back then, and he could have, under federal law, served 10 years, which would have put him in prison instead of, you know, out where he could buy guns and then go on the rampage that he went on. So there's a wide range, right? Something like knocking the cell phone out of someone's hand is a misdemeanor in some states. You know, something like what Rocky did with Michelle by getting that snake, where there wasn't physical violence involved, that would today have been charged as something like, you know, physical endangerment, which is I think it would have been a felony, actually. I'm not 100% sure about that in Montana. But so, you know, what I say is anytime someone feels palpable fear, you need to listen to that instinct in yourself. It's not really so much what the law says, right? Because the law is fungible, really. I mean, you can always work on charges. I've sat in rooms with, you know, groups of people who are like, well, can we charge them with this? Well, what about this one? We could charge them with this one, right? Someone that they're trying to hold, for example, for dangerousness. So it's not so much that, it's I would judge domestic violence by what you feel inside as the person who is standing at the receiving end of that. Do you feel fear? Do you feel like you shouldn't be talked to like that, right? Like, verbal abuse isn't going to get charged except when it's a threat to kill. Because what researchers will say is that people say all kinds of ugly things to each other, but they don't threaten to kill unless there's some truth behind it.
You were mentioning how some of the language and some other things started to kind of change around this in the 1970s. And I was thinking back, you know, we're talking about fiction writers and the kind of normalization of some of these things back at that time. I'm thinking about people like Norman Mailer, who I believe stabbed his wife, and, you know, William S. Burroughs shot his wife. And, you know, this was almost like a joke that they would tell about.
Yeah, Hemingway was abusive. Yeah.
It was like part of their mystique almost that people would talk about at the time.
Yeah. Someone's daughter? The daughter of I can't remember. He's a writer, like I'll think of it. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Well, my thought though is, you know, was there anything happening, I guess, because it sometimes seems like these things align, some of these social change. Was there anything happening in kind of the popular culture that was speaking to this issue that helped give any kind of momentum to rethinking about that? What makes me think about that was, I was trying to think back to any films, television, books, in terms of any kind of in that fictional genre that have really dealt with this in a way that has had any impact. The only thing I could think about like the last 35 years was like the movie about Tina Turner, right? Like there were some things there.
Yeah.
And that became like a subject. And that was kind of like her story was about overcoming this and all that. But I was just thinking, was there a moment in that time period or anything that you saw that brought this into the public consciousness from a pop culture standpoint?
In terms of fiction,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there is, but I was born in 1968, so I wasn't reading fiction until I was, you know, stole my friend's mother's Harlequins. And I can't think of fiction. I mean, there were some sort of moments in pop culture that were galvanizing. One of them was a Time magazine cover of, I think it was 1984, of the battered woman who, I cannot remember her name, But her face was just an absolute mess. And it was the cover of Time magazine, and it, you know, caught the attention of Gloria Steinem, and it really fueled that particular moment of the women's movement. Of course, there was the burning bed with Farrah Fawcett. That was a big one, and that was, you know, that was based on a real case. And that's where the term battered woman syndrome emerged from, which has been pretty much discounted by, I mean, it was almost discounted as soon as it was created, because it pathologizes domestic violence instead of saying, wait a minute, she's you know, or he's a victim of domestic violence, right? This isn't the same as having a mental illness. So
it's interesting that you said that, because, you know, what you were saying earlier was, you were mentioning the fact that the Violence Against Women Act ended up kind of being helping men in a way more than that. And you look at, there's kind of this genre of, like, I'm thinking about Sleeping with the Enemy or something like this with Julia Roberts. And, you know, it ends up where, you know, they have to kill this guy. So it ends up being still that the result a lot of these times in these pop cultural explorations of this is like, you guys have to murder this person to kind of get through that. Oh, did I lose? I think we froze up there. Matt, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think we may have lost Rachel for a second there.
Okay.
Hold on for a second. Bear with us, folks. Hey, Carissa, do you want to hop on here for a moment? We're going to let Rachel hop back on here. Hey, everybody, we've got Carissa Hon here from Domestic Violence Intervention Services. We're going to hop onto this conversation just for a second while we're getting Rachel back on. These darn Zoom links, you know, we're dependent on the internet. So Carissa is the communications officer over at DVIS, and we're so thankful for all the work that you guys do in our community here. I was wondering if you guys just know, you know, somewhat offhand, just in the last few months, what kind of increase you've seen in services needed, or any kind of calls that you've seen going up since this quarantine era started.
Absolutely. I actually do have some stats for you on that. So I can tell you that at DVIS specifically, our crisis line calls have actually gone up 22%. If you look at the past 6 months from last year, which is a pretty significant increase. TPD is also seeing the increases. So DV calls are actually the #1 calls that TPD gets, besides alarms going off anyway. So I'm so glad she's back. That's awesome.
I'm back. Sorry. All the power went out at my house. That wasn't scary at all. And I'm just on my phone. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm getting a couple. We're talking through a couple of local stats here with Carissa for just 1 second. Then we'll just dive back in there.
Okay. Perfect. So
go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So TPD actually received 192 more domestic violence calls January through July of this year. And then, as Rachel was talking about with strangulations, in June, the TPD strangulation calls actually went up 40%.
Just since June?
That was in June.
In June. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting, because, you know, Rachel was talking about the fact that we have some numbers from May, and, you know, as this pandemic goes on longer, frustrations and some of these things probably are going to get much worse. Carissa, where can people go to your website for resources, but what are 2 or 3 of the kind of most utilized resources that you offer, or if people want to know more about what DVIS can provide?
Certainly. So the #1 thing people think of when they think of a domestic violence agency is probably our shelter. We have safe housing. We have a 91+ bed shelter that we've had to get a little bit creative with during COVID to try to make sure that everyone's able to stay safe, but we are still open. We've remained open. We also have, of course, our shelter is a short-term solution. We have a longer-term solution in transitional housing. We have 20 apartments that are 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms that people can stay at. And I'd say the other services, we also have a legal department that can help with civil legal matters, can help as people fill out protective orders, things of that nature. And of course, counseling for both children and survivors. So for really the entire family.
Yeah. Well, for everybody watching, we're going to post some links here in the chat to some resources for DVIS, and we'll come back, and Carissa, we'll talk in a little bit after we're done. But thank you for that. All right, Rachel, you're back.
I am. That was very exciting. I have to say, thunder or lightning, something was hit so close to my house a few hours ago that my whole house shook. So I'm not surprised at all that the power went out.
Hey, this is like, this makes our thing more exciting, you know?
Right.
So we were just talking with Carissa from our local domestic violence intervention services about some shelter opportunities. One of the things you've talked about and written about is the fact that when it comes to shelters and the resources people are looking for, you know, domestic violence is one of, if not the only crime that puts the onus on the victim to kind of have to figure out these situations and have to kind of escape. And it's a really unique situation when you're dealing with a crime that you basically put all the weight on these decisions on the actual victim. Can you explore that just a little bit?
No, I just am like, oh, sure. It'd be like if your house was burgled and you called the police and the police came and said, my God, this is terrible. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Well, the burglars are going to move in and we're going to move you out to a different place now. Like, that's what it means to me. I know that shelter is necessary in some cases, but it is extremely disruptive, right? Most shelters are still at least in theory, in secret locations. So, you know, if your kids are in school, you have to take them out of school. If the only shelter beds available are, 3 hours away, upstate, and you live downstate, then you're screwed. If you're taking care of aging parents, if you have a pet, if you have fine china that you're afraid your abuser is going to break that comes from your great grandmother. I mean, people don't think about all these details, but shelter is really a pretty terrible answer that we've created. It's not, the idea doesn't originate with me, but what I always say is, look, we have this shelter system. We have more than 2,000 shelters across the country. At the same time, we have a problem with mass incarceration. We cannot arrest our way out of domestic violence. So why don't we put the abusers in the shelters? They can still contribute. That would treat them like halfway houses or transition homes, right? Where they go to their job or whatever. And then they come back and they have, education. They have classes. They have, they do this in Israel. They've been doing this in Israel for 20 years. And I was supposed to go report on it before COVID hit. So I can't speak to the efficacy of it, but I think it's a really creative idea that begins to look at two problems at once, at least here in the States, right? Mass incarceration and domestic violence, which are just, they're just twined around each other like vines. So, so I think shelter is, I think people who work in shelters are really doing, God's work to some extent, but you're housing traumatized people, traumatized kids with other traumatized kids. And you're not really making the abuser accountable. What you're saying is the abuser's freedom is prioritized over this victim's safety.
When you're out there doing all the reporting for the book and you're having to have pretty tough conversations with people that had maybe the worst moments of their life, including murder and other things happen in their life. One, what is that like kind of to your psyche, kind of dealing with that day to day? And two, you have so many opportunities here to talk to not just one side. You made it a point to talk to both sides of families who usually would have, very different opinions on certain things. But talk about the dynamic of talking to two sides of one family that have been involved with such horrific stuff. Yeah.
I mean, with Rocky and Michelle, the story that kind of opens the book and takes us through the first 100 pages or so, I talked to Michelle's family for several years before Rocky's family would agree to talk to me. And in fact, even when they agreed, his mother, Sarah, said she would talk to me, but that his father wouldn't. He hadn't spoken to the media. He hadn't spoken to anybody, only the police. And this is something, by the way, that happened almost 20 years ago. So at the time that I was reporting on it, it was, 6 or 7 maybe. And so I flew out to Billings and I mean, the first thing you see is just that these are people who could be your parents. Right? There is nothing special about them. There's nothing bad. There's nothing, good, really. I mean, they're just normal people. And they have this kind of shadow of pain that, of course, they don't talk about. Why would you? And, after a few hours, they said, like, we feel all the terror that Michelle's family feels. We feel all the pain. We lost our son, our daughter-in-law, and our grandchildren too. But we also feel the guilt. But interestingly, Michelle's family feels the guilt too, because they're like, what didn't we see? What didn't we see? It just ripples through. I mean, when I was in Montana, people, advocates, police officers, everybody would talk about this familicide with just a raw kind of pain. Like, it still haunts them today. And it's definitely hard for me. I mean, I had a sort of breakdown in the fall of 2014 writing this, and I took a whole year off. I just painted and read and, did nothing to do with violence. And the first day that I interviewed Sarah and Gordon, Rocky's parents, I spent 7 hours with them. And I've had a whole career's worth of technological breakdowns. So I always record and take notes at the same time, and it keeps my brain engaged. And after 7 hours straight of taking notes, these 3 fingers on my right hand went numb for 6 weeks. I had to have acupuncture to bring the feeling back. And I really think that is like a psychosomatic, like a biological response to just how traumatic it was to sit with them for that many hours and talk about it.
Yeah. When you are working with family members on things like that, beyond the interviews, they have to trust you. Ultimately, you're putting the stories out there. You're obviously not, taking edits from these people, but, what kind of responses are you getting from the families since the book came out? Are you hearing from these people? Do you have any kind of continued relationship with them?
Oh yeah, almost everyone. The
Yeah.
only person I don't have a continued relationship in the book is Jimmy Espinoza, who's one of the abusers, and actually he was already mad at me, when the book came out. So
Jimmy,
yeah.
Was Jimmy, remind me, Jimmy, was Jimmy
he was the former pimp. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. He's the one who didn't like that I didn't think he was incredible because he was, not violent anymore. I was like, so you're just a normal guy.
That's one of the more fascinating characters in the book. And he ends up, we won't have time to get into it, but he ends up becoming kind of this leader of men and kind of this charismatic figure. Really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in touch with all of them still today. We write to each other every now and again, but I will tell you just quickly one little anecdote. Rocky's sister had never spoken to anybody and, would not speak to me for the book, nor would her brother, Rocky's surviving brother. And when the book came out, maybe 3 months after it came out, I was in LA doing a reading, and Sarah, Rocky's mother, had called me and said Rocky's sister lived there and she was thinking about coming to the reading. And if she was willing to come, Sarah was going to fly from Montana and come. And she did. The two of them did. And Rocky's sister told me after the reading that when her mom first gave her the book, she hid it in a duvet. Like she didn't want to look at it. And then she had her best friend read it. And her best friend said, no, it's okay. You can read it. Like, she's fair to Rocky. And so she read it. And she told me when she finished reading Rocky and Michelle's story, it was the first time she had slept through the night entirely since the murders. No. I mean, we're just sobbing in that bookstore in LA, the three of us just sobbing. I've had Michelle's mother, Sally, come to my readings. I did a reading with a detective who's in the book, Martina Latessa, who's also a really hilarious character. She's a lot of fun. And then, Dante, one of the guys who was trying so hard to be nonviolent, and then he got into some trouble. I don't want to give it away. No spoiler alerts. Yeah. But he's recently resurfaced. He resurfaces every couple of years. So, yeah.
one of the things that you do so well that I think is so difficult is you somehow do this. There's obviously an inherent judgment in the fact that these people have committed horrible acts, but you don't treat them like monsters in the sense of like this other thing. They're damaged people who a lot of times have come from really damaged backgrounds, and you relay that fairly very clearly. My thought is, how much do you think of domestic violence from the men mostly as something that is a modeled behavior and is something that's almost hereditary in the sense of it gets passed down from parents to kids?
Yeah, like 98% for sure. Yeah, I mean, even you look at our prisons today, right? Gosh, the power went out again. No, it didn't. Something happened. Anyway, there's something going on here.
Flicker.
Yeah, but my phone is still working, so fingers crossed. Yeah, you look at our prisons today, and something like 96% of women were either childhood victims or victims, of domestic violence as adults, or they were trafficked, or there's some sort of abuse in their background. For men, that figure is like 80%. It begets violence. And that's one of the things that is so chilling about COVID is that we are right now, like, child abuse is something that is really reported by third parties almost all the time, teachers, social workers, whatever. And child abuse reports are way, way down. And I had an emergency room doctor say to me, it's not the COVID patients I'm going to remember during this period. It's the children, the abused children. And my fear is that we are perfectly grooming the next generation of abused kids, No. But I have to say, like, I lived in Cambodia for 6 years. And one of the things I thought about almost endlessly in the kind of months and weeks leading up to my moving there was what it was going to look like to live in a country where the former perpetrators lived alongside their victims. Like, what did that look like?
Are you talking about the Khmer Rouge?
The Khmer Rouge, yeah. The second house I lived there, I lived 6 houses down from a guy named Ing Sari who died recently, a couple years ago. But he was one of the only 5 people ever tried for the War Crimes Tribunal. And I would see him pull his little white Camry out, and his grandkids would be all around him and stuff. He was one of the architects of the Khmer Rouge genocide, Mm-hmm. And so there's something to that. There's something about the hopefulness of knowing that, that there can always be like the other side. Somehow we can get there.
Yeah. We have a question from one of our viewers, and the question is kind of about what we were talking about in relation to shelters and your thought about how to redo that process. And the question says, under the model that you suggest, how would you protect the women from the abuser if the batterer is sheltered but can leave?
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, ankle bracelets and GPS monitoring and all that stuff. I mean, this isn't absolute freedom. This is just as you would have in a halfway house, right? You are allowed to go to your work and you're allowed to come back, and that's it, right? So it's
still be things, like protective orders and things like that would still be.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'm a writer. I'm not a social scientist, and I'm not an advocate. People can do a better job than me at this, but I just feel like this is a really potentially creative solution. Like, I'm going to say it every time I have an opportunity to talk, and somebody someday is going to actually take up the mantle and try it.
Yeah. I want to bring in our friend Carissa from Domestic Violence Intervention Services just for a few minutes here toward the end. Hello, Carissa. I was just curious if you had any questions maybe for Rachel related to the work you do that maybe I didn't ask. I certainly don't have a monopoly on good questions here, but if there was anything that maybe popped up while you were listening that might be interesting to you.
I mean, I think you've been asking some really good questions. I've been really impressed. You're definitely very knowledgeable, Rachel, which I certainly appreciate.
Someone on Twitter the other day told me, just writing a book doesn't make you an expert. I was like, I think maybe it does actually.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
And she wrote the book on it. That's an actual phrase.
I know. I'm like,
Okay, I'm trying to think as far as questions. One of the things that really I appreciate that you brought up, I don't know if this is a question, but I really appreciated that you brought up the tendency for perpetrators to have grown up in a household where they witnessed domestic violence. The World Health Organization actually says that's the #1 indicator as far as whether or not someone will grow up to either be a victim or a perpetrator when they're an adult. So I thought that was really awesome that you brought that up. Because people don't, when they think about, we have a batterers intervention program at DVIS. So when they think about perpetrators, they just think of a monster, and they don't think of them as human even sometimes.
Right.
So I think that that's a really good point.
I think that's partly because, you know, movies like The Burning Bed, it's been a while since I've seen it, say 30 years or so. But my recollection is that he really was a monster in that movie. And what that does again is just like with the language, it just flattens the idea of who could be a perpetrator and who can't. That's why you see in news stories all the time, and Clarissa, I'm sure this probably does your head in as it does mine, a neighbor who's like, oh, no, he seems so nice, I think he just snapped. Like, there is no such thing as the snap, right? There's people who, I mean, we equate, and judges do this all the time actually, anger management with abuser intervention, and it is not the same. Abusers know perfectly well, most of them know perfectly well how to act in public. They're not raging at their boss or their coworkers, right? It's like one person. At the same time, I've never met an abuser who's happy being an abuser, right? He or she, they don't want to be abusers. They don't want to be violent. They don't want to have unsatisfying relationships. And so they are violent because they are also people in pain. And so my goal was to like carve away until I could figure out where that, you know, that pain kind of fault line was. And I think you're right. It starts with kids. It starts in childhood.
So Rachel, I don't know if you were on yet. I think you were back on when we were talking about some of our local statistics here, saying that you know, we'd seen a pretty massive spike in the last few months here locally with some of the calls and things like that. Carissa, are there any other stats that you didn't get a chance to mention to us about some of the things that are going on here?
I was able to mention all of the stats. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I can certainly look for more stats that I could send to you if you want to post them on social or something like that. I know that
my question for you would be, what do you do with that information? Is there some database that goes into? Do you report those numbers to something that goes into a larger national study for these?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of different places that we have to report things to. Actually, it's interesting you asked this today. Today is actually DV Census Day. And so all of the domestic violence shelters are supposed to catalog all of the numbers. We catalog everyone that is in our shelter, everyone that is using all of our services, and even the people that we may have to turn away. And we have to report all of those numbers so that nationally it gives them a screenshot of a day to kind of be able to report on.
Okay.
So I can add to that too, because this is my next project. It's probably not going to be my next book because it's going to take 5 or 6 years, but the CDC has a national database of violent death reporting system, it's called, and you have to have permission to access that database. But then within that database, every state puts forward, not every state, actually a bunch of states don't, intimate partner violence statistics. And some states are super shitty at doing it, and other states are a little bit better. But Oklahoma also has the highest rates of incarceration for women.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we're #1 there.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
We're on the top of a lot of bad lists, at the bottom a lot of good lists, but we're working on it. We're working on it. So my last question, Rachel, is this: you brought up some politics a little earlier, and we'd be foolish not to talk about it and say, you brought up the Violence Against Women Act. That was a bill co-sponsored by Joe Biden, who's now the Democratic nominee. My question to you is, what kind of change in this policy can be made from the top down? You kind of made the argument that it's kind of modeling, the language and everything being used by the current president is kind of feeding its way down, but it's not really policy. But is there actual policy that can be implemented from that level that would actually make some change?
Yes. Yeah. Right now, for example, there are only 2 states where you can hold someone who is very, very dangerous pre-trial. Now, this is controversial because holding someone pre-trial goes against the Constitution, right, which says everyone is innocent until proven guilty. But in cases where someone has, strangled someone, threatened them with a gun, beat them while pregnant, things that are all on that danger assessment, it would be great if states could implement some way to prove dangerousness in cases of domestic violence and hold abusers for that accountability. There's just maybe two other things I'll mention, because I could go on and on about that. But wait, no, what? I forgot one of them. Okay, it'll come back to me. But we can alter our self-defense laws. This is one of the things I'm really looking at right now, because right now, the way our self-defense laws are written, they assume someone of equal weight, equal intent, equal power, for example, equal access to weapons. And that's not actually true in the case of domestic violence or domestic violence homicide. Most of the time, the woman is weaker, smaller, physically smaller. And so what happens is, very often actually kitchen knives are used by women as self-defense, and they end up killing their abuser, and they go to prison for life without parole, or 25 years or 70 years or however long they go, but a long, long time. They tend to get longer prison sentences than men because they've used a weapon, right? They had to use a weapon. So Canada and Australia have rewritten their self-defense laws so that gender, size, physical ability, and domestic violence history has to be taken into account. That's something that we could look into. We could also look into coercive control. They've done this in other countries, the UK, France, Ireland, where they've created coercive control laws that would, for example, what Rocky did by keeping that snake in the cage in his house, used that as a method to control Michelle. There's a lot of technology control these days, or monitoring on GPS, things like that are not physical violence, but are still domestic violence. We could create some laws about that. Oh, I remember the other thing I was going to say. I knew it would come to me. The last thing is, though, we could actually implement the laws that already exist on the books. The number one being, I bet Clarissa could answer this if I throw this to her. Take away the... Is she there?
Yeah.
Guns.
Yeah.
Sorry,
take away the guns. Yeah, take away the guns.
I mean, that's totally what you were going to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
100%.
Of course. Yeah. For convicted abusers, take away their guns, right? Look at Omar Mateen. He wasn't convicted. Had he been convicted, he would not have, at least in theory, been able to get a gun. Yeah. Relinquish the guns of those who convict. California has done a really good job in this, and you could see their numbers going down. So those are the 3 or 4 things that I would do just immediately.
Yeah. Well, those are nice, real world solutions to maybe some problems. I want to say a big thank you to Carissa for joining us. Also, Carissa, remind everybody, if they want to donate and support DVIS, what website do we go to give money to DVIS?
Oh, sure. You can go to dvis.org.
DVIS.org. And also tonight, remember, get a copy of your book, support DVIS, read this amazing book. You're going to be glad you did. I want to say a big thank you to Rachel for joining us, and also through getting through the technical difficulties and coming back. We didn't know if we were going to get you back or not, but we did.
Yep.
I really
I was
appreciate
like, zoom.
Yeah. But congratulations again on the book, and I really look forward to what's next. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Hey, everybody, stay safe, take care of each other, and we will see you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.